on November 24th, Israel and Hamas entered a 4-day ceasefire and began conducting daily prisoner swaps. Qatar mediated a 2-day extension on the last day of the truce, and the United States called for further extensions contingent on the release of more hostages. Prior to the pause in fighting, Israeli troops dropped leaflets in southern Gaza telling residents to evacuate, suggesting a possible expansion of its operations. The UN ramped up aid deliveries during the ceasefire, but nearly 400,000 people remain trapped in northern Gaza, where Israeli operations have forced all but one hospital to suspend operations. Hamas has reportedly positioned itself within and below civilian infrastructure, and Israeli strikes on civilian locations like the Jabalia refugee camp have caused massive collateral damage. Meanwhile, the United States is conducting shuttle diplomacy amid simmering regional tensions. Israel continues to exchange rocket fire with Hezbollah in Lebanon and strike alleged Iran-linked targets in Syria. Iran-backed groups have launched dozens of attacks on US military positions in Iraq and Syria, and Yemen's Houthi rebels entered the fray by launching missiles at Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict dates back to the end of the 19th century. In 1947, the United Nations adopted Resolution 181, known as the Partition Plan, which sought to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was created, sparking the First Arab-Israeli War. The war ended in 1949 with Israel's victory, but 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, and the territory was divided into 3 parts: the State of Israel, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Gaza Strip. Over the following years, tensions rose in the region, particularly between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Following the 1956 Suez Crisis and Israel's invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria signed mutual defense pacts in anticipation of a possible mobilization of Israeli troops. In June 1967, following a series of maneuvers by Egyptian President Abdel Gamal Nasser, Israel preemptively attacked Egyptian and Syrian air forces, starting the Six-Day War. After the war, Israel gained territorial control over the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. 6 years later, in what is referred to as the Yom Kippur War or the October War, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise 2-front attack on Israel to regain their lost territory. The conflict did not result in significant gains for Egypt, Israel, or Syria, but Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat declared the war a victory for Egypt, as it allowed Egypt and Syria to negotiate over previously ceded territory. Finally, in 1979, following a series of ceasefires and peace negotiations, representatives from Egypt and Israel signed the Camp David Accords, a peace treaty that ended the 30-year conflict between Egypt and Israel. Even though the Camp David Accords improved relations between Israel and its neighbors, the question of Palestinian self-determination and self-governance remained unresolved. In 1987, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip rose up against the Israeli government in what is known as the First Intifada. The 1993 Oslo-Sykes-Picot Accords mediated the conflict, setting up a framework for the Palestinians to govern themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, and enabled mutual recognition between the newly established Palestinian Authority and Israel's government. In 1995, the Oslo II Accords expanded on the first agreement, adding provisions that mandated the complete withdrawal of Israel from 6 cities and 450 towns in the West Bank. In 2000, sparked in part by Palestinian grievances over Israel's control over the West Bank, a stagnating peace process, and former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. In September 2000, Palestinians launched the Second Intifada, which would last until 2005. In response, the Israeli government approved the construction of a barrier wall around the West Bank in 2002. Despite opposition from the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Factionalism among the Palestinians flared up when Hamas won the Palestinian Authority's parliamentary elections in 2006, deposing longtime majority party Fatah. This gave Hamas, a political and militant movement inspired by the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, control of the Gaza Strip. Gaza is a small piece of land on the Mediterranean Sea that borders Egypt to the south and has been under the rule of the semi-autonomous Palestinian Authority since 1993. The United States and European Union, among others, did not acknowledge Hamas's electoral victory, as the group has been considered a terrorist organization by Western governments since the late 19 teens.